What we're going to do, welcome everybody. Now that the recording's been pressed, how you doing? This is the MII TED Talk Club, where we have just watched a video on how language impacts on the way that we think. We have a guest panel that we're going to come to in a second. So if everybody else could keep their microphone on silent, we're going to bring them in and we're going to ask questions. So we're going to analyze what happened in this video to see whether it could help us as mediators, or if you're a coach or a mentor or a manager or whatever. Let's see where these go. So our first guest that we have is a chap called Michael Lang. He's the author of this book. He's come all the way from America. I hope he's there, and I hope he's going to come in and speak to us and maybe tell us one thing that he takes away from this particular video. Michael, are you there?
I am right here. Thank you, Scott. I've watched the video now, not just today, but previously, and the one example that came to my mind is a very early one in my practice, and it was not unique to me in mediation practice, but was one that really sort of spread across the professions who worked with families who were particularly divorcing families or families after a divorce and separation. And that was the shift in talking not about custody, but about parenting. It was the same decisions that parents had to make about arrangements for their children, time spent with the children, decisions that they would be making in behalf of their children's interests. But as soon as we use the word custody, it became a battle. It became a fixed sum kind of discussion where whatever one received, the other lost. And as soon as we talked about parenting, it was a shared sense of responsibility. They were parents. They shared the parenting, presumably the biological, as well as then the ongoing parenting of their children. And it was a very dramatic impact on the nature of the work, that as soon as you could make that kind of shift, people could better see the value of working together for the sake of their children, rather than fighting as adults with the children lost someplace off to the side.
Yeah, if I maybe continue with you, Michael, just on that particular thing, because I'm assuming that if you stuck to the custody word, you would end up with more transactional agreements coming out of it. They'd be fighting over quantum, whatever it happens to be, your days. And if it's a parenting thing, you'd get a more transformational, or more likely to get a transformational type of agreement. Does that mean if you look at this video about language and the way it thinks, that it might be more difficult finding the shared word if people come from different cultures or have different languages?
Inevitably. And in fact, finding the shared, look, in my experience, people who have established relationships, whether it's in the workplace or families or in any friendships, they learn to speak in code.
Yeah.
They have adopted their own sort of interpretations for words that have common usage. My job as the mediator, our job as professionals, in this case mediators, is to learn the code.
Yeah.
Because if we don't learn the code, we're likely to interfere with their conversation, confuse them. Whereas if we learn the code, we can work together with them. And there's not only the functional ability to work more successfully, it also builds confidence in the relationship of us as professionals with them as clients.
Okay, thank you, Michael. For those who don't know Michael, he is a mediator with more than 40 years' experience. You might have picked that up there in the areas of family, workplace, organisational, congregational, and public policy disputes. He's the founding director of the Master of Arts programme in conflict resolution at Antioch University. Amongst other works, he is the author of A Guide to Reflective Practice in Conflict Resolution that I just showed you. We'll come back to Michael in a second, but our second guest that we've got here is the new president of the MII. That's Andrea O'Neill. She's the founder of ACON Resolutions. She's an accredited MII mediator, holds a master's in mediation and conflict intervention. She has had specialist training in separating couples and child inclusive mediation. Andrea is a certified Synergy conflict management coach, and she's also the MII lead for collaboration with the Irish Red Cross. So, Andre, welcome to the MII TED Talk Club. What did you pick up, or are there any things you want to, leading on from where Michael's been with this shared code? Anything you want to pick up here?
Yeah, I think really for me watching that, language is fascinating. I think even as mediators, we have our own language, and sometimes we have to be aware of that when we're in the room with, people that we have got so used to that language that sometimes we forget to give the interpretation of what that is. But going back to some of the things that Michael was talking about, and it's as a mediator, we really have to understand what people mean by certain things, like say uncoding the language, as Michael spoke about. And sometimes that means we have to be very clever with the questions we ask. Because for me, I suppose one of my greatest one of the greatest learnings, through mediations, is that language is determined, or the words that we use, the meaning is determined by the receiver. So if one person says something in the room, they may have one intention and they may kind of mean that to, be something else. But the person that receives it, why have they've received it in a different way, and they will interpret what that means. So it's nearly as if our words are behind bars, and when they hit the other person and they start deciphering it, the gates, or the prison cell is opened, and then it's a free-for-all for them to determine what's meant by it. And I think as a mediator, what we have to do,
you think they could explain things much more clearly, wouldn't you think?
Maria, could you switch off your microphone, please, for the panel's on? Thanks. On you go, Andrea.
So I think what it is that as a mediator, we're going in there and we have to ask questions to understand what are they trying to communicate to the other person. So what is the context underneath the words? What is the need that they're trying to address? What is the interest? And it's through that questioning, that process, that we get underneath the language as mediators. I was laughing when I was watching that video for the first time the other day, and today again when I watched it. And I think I shared this story with you, Scott and Bob, the other day. I was the victim of, or I'd say my husband was the victim of me going to, you broke it, as opposed to it's broken. You broke it by accident. I went to it's broken. And really to actually watch that video and go, oh, okay, I actually used the wrong pronoun there. If I had said, it's broken, there would have been a completely different reaction to it. So I think really being mindful of our language, but then bringing that into the mediation room and being able to get underneath it with the parties so they can understand each other's language or each other's code.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Now I'm going to pass on to Ilona Koop-Leek, who's our third panel member. She left home, our home country of Germany, with her family in 2011 to live in the southwest of France in 2016. They lived in Ireland for a year, where she discovered her love for our island and its people. And since 2019, she's been on the panel of mediators of family mediation in Belfast.
Really good.
Ilona, you speak languages that use masculine and feminine words here, and I was very interested, just picking up again where Andre's picked up about the intent and the impact of words that are used. Is there anything you'd like to chat about there?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I wanted to say, and I think I mentioned it earlier on when we met the first time, but I Well, I speak 3 languages fairly okay, so hopefully my English is good enough today. So, which makes me extremely humble still. So I speak 3 out of 7,000. So, which makes me aware that I don't speak so many other languages. And actually, regarding mediation, it's interesting because I always thought that mediation is a sort of language or kind of language, what you said, Andrea, like another language learned through training, and we maybe sometimes have already in our personal skills, natural skills. And I really always thought kind of arrogantly, so we can mediate anybody, but I couldn't mediate this Aboriginal community because I'm already struggling well, I think South is there behind me. So you see how limiting, although we know a lot of languages and even we are firm with our own natural language, but how limited even our own language is when we want to speak to someone else. Regarding the feminine, if you have articles like the English, you only have the and the a and the n, so which is kind of limited. Well, I don't want to be. But anyway, so in German we have articles, and it's exactly what she said in the video. It's interesting how when I sometimes speak to a client in French and they use an article for a word which is in my language, German, and different. So if he, for example, a client says he, and I would say it is an it, or it's neutral, because you not only have feminism and the masculinism, but you have also the neutral part. So then sometimes it strikes me so how different the language is, and I've never really thought about it, only after watching the video. So I'm much more aware of it actually. And something what you said, Michael, is interesting as well, because for example, in Northern Ireland, our service, we say we don't discuss access to the children regarding family mediation, but we talk about visiting time, for example. When I talk to my clients here in France about visiting time, for them it's just not enough. They really look at me and say, if I would say visiter, so only visiting their children or their children them, then they would say, well, that's not what I want. I want to have the full thing. I want to have responsibility and visiter. So visiting is not enough. So you can see how in many little underlying things, this is really can get really complicated.
Yeah, thank you, Ilona. And I'll come to Bob now. Bob is an MII council member in charge of governance. Following a career in corporate and project recovery roles, Bob Cree-Hay now practices as a mediator and dispute negotiator. Bob is both CEDAR and MII accredited and has been assisting clients to resolve contractual performance and technical disputes in the major program and project management space for the last 20 years. He acts primarily in the commercial, workplace, family and civil sectors with a focus on small and medium enterprises, family-owned businesses, partnerships and individuals. So Bob, picking up from where Ilona took place, if I'm reading the room here, that's one of those shorthand things that Michael talked about, but if I'm reading the room here, Bob, what effectively Ilona's chatting about there is we almost create barriers, or there's the possibility that we create barriers between ourselves and the parties by using language which, as Andre said, is picked up by the receiver differently than we intend. So any comments on the video in general, Bob?
I think picking up on what everyone said, and also having watched the video now for a number of times, the video has landed with me very differently every time I've listened to it. And that's not because she said anything different. She said exactly the same thing every time, but it's landed differently. And what that brings back to me, and I think Andrea hinted at it earlier, was that we have intent. What is our intent when we speak? And that got me thinking about thinking. Because in order to verbalize, you must have a thought. So it made me, in a rather sort of self-deprecating sort of ways, what am I thinking? Am I thinking before I speak, or am I thinking as I speak? And then am I thinking about what I've just said? And if I'm doing all of that, there's not very much room in there for me to be doing my active listening. So we talk about, and we were chatting earlier about how Michael's getting on in Florida, and here we are, and we often say with our American cousins that we're separated by a common language, and that's very important. Now I find that with my colleagues in the MII sometimes. We are separated by a common language, because I have a lot of little witticisms and Scots vernaculars as well, and they all land very differently. Alone and I, we are both mediators for Family Mediation Northern Ireland. And as Alone said, we would never talk about access. We talk about visiting times. But visiting times to some clients would infer when you're going to see someone in the hospital. So these are all very, very different things. And Alona, you speak 3 languages. I would probably suggest that most people on this call are at least 2 behind you. So we've got 6,999 left. And by the way, this common language that we all have. And I actually think with our English language, we've sometimes become rather idle and rather indolent about how we use it and what we do with it, because we have this huge lexicon available to us. So I won't go into the area of what we use in mediation. I'd like to hold that for later on. But it really is that about that language. What's my intent? What am I saying? But I don't control how it lands.
Okay, I'll bring back Michael. Just on that, are there any comments that you'd like to make, or any other observations about the on what you heard from the others?
I'm just in. I'll be in 20 minutes. What are you doing inside?
Richard, could you turn your mic off? Good, Michael, you come in.
I'm here. Good. I don't. What I'm hoping is 2 things. Bob, I agree with you about the separation in terms of not the ocean but language as more, and it's so interesting that words that would seem to have common meaning are very different among English speakers because of culture. And I hope, Scott, that we can get and turn ourselves to talking about the impact of culture, both culture with a small c, that is the sort of more intimate notions about culture having to do with families and community and even those sorts of things, as well as the large C, culture having to do with the broader, larger state-based or area or geographic-based kinds of culture. Because I think that our work is, so I'll jump back now. Our work is based on language. We can't do our work without language. And the accuracy with which we communicate and invite the people we work with to communicate has everything to do with whether they will find a common purpose and a common understanding and a way in which they can address their dispute so that it suits them. And one of the great challenges for us is to do what Bob was saying, and that is to be able to really listen at the same time without constantly formulating a response to what we're listening to.
Yeah,
it's really critical, and to think, Ilona, about working across languages and the unique characteristics of those languages. I am monolingual, sadly, and yet my son, who lives in Berlin, and my grandchildren, who are also bilingual in Germany, listening to them, especially the grandchildren who are 8 years old, going back and forth between English and German, and sometimes struggling to find the right English word because they're thinking in German, or because they're talking now in English and they can't quite grasp the right German word to express what they want. They are a wonderful little petri dish, of ways of examining the impact of language and thought.
Can I take you, Michael, or just keep on the words of culture and language? Because I remember I had a mediation where one of the parties refused to come to a joint session because she said she didn't have a dispute. And since then, I've been using all kinds of different language to okay, there's differences, okay, difference of opinion, whatever it happens to be. That I've got a series of words that I might use. But your president used the word dictator, and we were chatting earlier about how things are received, and that has been received. I don't know if you're aware, but it's been received fairly badly over in Europe by using the word. And yet you've got words that would, I suppose, within America. You were saying earlier you're in Florida at the Gulf of Mexico. Somebody changes that has a totally different impact on different people depending on the audience that you're going through. So this code thing that you're chatting about, understanding the code and the language, I think that's known by certain players geopolitically. But what about any comments on those kind of things, or the things that you've got in America going at the moment?
I don't, Scott. Do we have 6, 8, 10 hours to talk about it? The fact is that because of the polarization in the country, if I'm talking to people and I'm not sure where their political leanings are, I just simply refer to it as the Gulf. And then we see where things, I'm very careful about the language I use. And hopefully people who have a different political persuasion from me would do the same kind of thing out of respect, to try to understand whether there are differences between us in that respect. And if so, how we would manage them.
Yeah. Now we have the same issues in the north of Ireland, or Northern Ireland, or the 6 counties, or where you're going, with Derry or Londonderry and that kind of stuff. There's many words where you've got to watch what you're saying, I suppose, because it would have an impact on people, and if you're doing congregational stuff, there would be presumably words or certain religious things that you wouldn't touch, you wouldn't go near. Type of thing. Okay. So it's going to land here. We're moving how language not only impacts on the way we think, but to some extent, because we're trying to make sense of the stuff that we're about to say, it also impacts on what we hear, because we've got all these neurons going off at the same time. So, Andrea, is there anything else in this whole language piece, thinking piece, landing wrong, all that kind of stuff that you want to draw out and bring
I
back
think
in?
really it's just that, so we're talking about language and thinking, but it's language, thinking, and feeling. And I think you can't separate it. Like, our language is so connected to, our experience, our history, our everything, about us. And I mean, it's the languages, Michael's talked earlier on, the code that you grew up with within your home, the code you grew up with in your school environment, the code you grow up with or that you develop into in the workplace. And so for, different people, words will trigger them in different ways. And I think that's really, it's not just about the language and the thought process, it's about the language and the feeling process as well. And I think also, I suppose, one of the things that we're very mindful in mediation is that, language is not just the verbal word, that we have, we've body language, we have silence, we have, there's language is so much bigger than the verbal spoken word. And I think that's a really important thing. And I mean, it's even how we move in a room. Like, when we're in a mediation room, we move closer if we want somebody to know that we're listening to them, so that we can get into that zone. That's a language in itself. I have communicated in some way that I'm here to listen to you and I want to hear you. So I think really to connect, that it's not just verbal, it's also, our body language, it's also our feelings. I mean, maybe that moving forward makes somebody feel heard and listened to and feel safe. But then there's the danger that if we get too close, we're infringing on their space and we have to move back. So we have to be so in tune with what we're communicating, but also how that communication is being received. And then looking at what and we're monitoring the parties all the time, or the people in the room. I don't like using the word parties, but the people in the room, we're monitoring them all the time to ascertain kind of what's going on with their body language. What are they trying to communicate that they're not saying? So what is the language they're not verbalizing that we need to bring into the room? So, I mean, I think we said it the other day, you could go on with this conversation for 10 hours and still not get to the end of it, because it is such an integral part of what we do. And yeah, so I think for me, it's not to forget about the emotion and the feeling behind it and the history. So words have history.
Okay, I'll bring in Alona next. Alona, Sharon's just put in a little question there, and I suppose told me off a little bit, but that's fair enough. Scott, you mentioned to Michael, your president, when I would take umbrage. If someone said to me, you're this or that, which is fair enough, I would use the president stated XYZ, not personalising it, purely because we don't know that person on the receiving end will take the spoken word, if you know what I mean. Thanks. So, Alona, you can see there, just on that piece, in fairness to what Sharon's saying, there's an element of me saying, that guy's nothing to do with me by that word, you're. Right, I'm pushing it on to Michael there. I pushed it on to Michael, I think. I think that's a fair point that's been picked up there, as opposed to naming him as Donald Trump, or the way that you might use the word Trump as opposed to Donald Trump or the president of the US or whatever. Alona, have you any comments on that, the way that that has impacted on some of the people on the call, or for mediators? Alona's disappeared.
Oh, she's muted. Ilona? Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
I actually, you know, sometimes I have difficulties because at the very start of the video, she says, so speaking a different language or other languages is like having another soul.
Yeah.
For me, it's like to have another mentality. It's also to widen your spirit in a certain way, that you are maybe more open-minded, although I don't want to say that if you have to speak more languages to be open-minded. But when I work with my French people, I'm kind of French. And when I try to work with my Irish people, I try to be a bit Irish. And that's actually what you said, Andrea. I have to, or you, Scott, I have to learn a lot about your culture. What are the difficulties? What are the things I better don't address, or I address, or what is it okay for me to address it because I'm not Irish,
Yeah.
but I'm a German, French, Irish, I don't know, whatever mediator. So but the only difficulties I have sometimes is that I see that I'm very direct. And of course, I'm on guard every time when I'm doing mediation with certain people. Then I'm always having in my head, okay, well, don't be too direct, because it's in my mentality. If I have a problem, then I just say it, kind of. So, which helps me to create this to have this awareness, actually. You know, so other people would be direct and they would not even think about it, and they just do it. And this gives me, for me, it's like a present, it's like a gift, something that well, there are multiple boxes I have to open, and then I have to close it again, and so on. It sounds really difficult, but it's actually this flexibility in the brain, and hopefully, if I get Alzheimer's, it will be less bad or longer good for me, because I have this thing in my brain developed only by accident because I speak 3 languages. And it's really like sometimes what you said, Michael, I see that as well. Sometimes I have a word, I'm speaking English and I want to say a certain word, and that only the German word comes into my mind. And it's only because it just fits better, even though I know the English word, but I just want to say the German word because it's shaped in the right way. It feels good. And it's the thing, what you said about feelings. It's really like feeling and reading also the people you're sitting in a mediation, and not only listening only, well, we have to listen, but it's to read how they are, how the aura they have, or if they're happy to do this or not. And so really look at them. So we don't only need our language, but we also need our eyes, actually. So very much so.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Schadenfreude, that's a German word we use quite a lot.
And I am very Schadenfreude.
It's one of my favorites. I take huge. No, I don't. Anyway, Bob, Bob, we'll bring you back in here. Here you come, Bob. Following on that question from Sharon, we've also got one from Tony Carney. Has Lyra got it the wrong way around? Not how language shapes the way we think, but rather how we think shapes the language we use. And that might be words.
Sure.
Any comments on that one, or any other comments you want to do before that?
I think yeah, absolutely. But Ilona being an advocate for Esperanto, which was the attempt at a European language, which, you know, in the sheer logic of having one linear language that we could all, but yet of course it failed almost at the first attempt. And why? Because what's language connected to? And of course it's connected to our very soul, our very core. One thing we've not talked a huge amount today about is censorship, because you can't have language without censorship. And for me, and I think there is a censorship in mediation. There's the censorship of ourselves, the censorship of others, whether we would admit to it or not. We do censor others. You know, we ask people for ground rules, and when they don't give them to us, we suggest ground rules. So if that's not censorship, we don't know what is. And then there's systemic censorship, because we have this lexicon around mediation, which effectively says there is a language to mediation, a non-adversarial language. So is that benign censorship? And I think there is, but in a positive way. Do I censor in all three of those areas? Yes, but in a positive way. What I concentrate more on, and I think both Michael and Andrea hinted at it, is that calibrating your language. I think we calibrate our language in a way to achieve impact. And that is, how is this going to, first of all, how is it going to land? And what is that impact? Because we know if we say certain things, so and I know you picked up on it, Scott, Michael's idea of this code. Yeah, if you're in the military, there's a language, there's loads of acronyms, and that then becomes tribal. So as a mediator, if you're not aware, if you're not, as you said a few seconds ago, reading the room, then you're in a tricky space. So we calibrate to achieve an impact, and in that case, we're not passive. One thing I find myself doing using my language is I try to assimilate, and that's almost a defensive mechanism where you try to assimilate into that room, into that code. And I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing, because the other thing we haven't talked about today is with languages, because language is broadcast. The opposite to that is the reception of it, and how do our words land? Because many of our clients will be hanging on our every word, and they will be looking for where we are. They'll be looking for the asymmetrical leaning towards one side or another. So language in mediation, language per se, powerful stuff.
I'm going to bring back Michael, if that's okay, folks. Michael, there's a question there about my use of the word "your president," I suppose, and how might that land? And I'm picking up other things here about how we whether it's language or specific words that we know will either raise a flag, raise a hair, or have an impact. We can think about those. We also have other skills where we can apologize. Right? I got it wrong. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realize that. If you keep doing it, it's maybe not as authentic. But there's authenticity about the way that we react to the reaction once it's been received. So are there any comments about that?
I totally agree with that idea. I mean, we can't possibly understand who these people are, even if we grew up next door to them, right? They're still different. They still have a different family. They have different relatives. They have different ways of thinking and expressing themselves. And it's a challenge for us to always to be able to learn. And I think the great key to that, in addition to the obvious, which is listening, really paying attention, is humility. And you hint at that, Scott, with the idea about apology. And I'll tell you a very silly story that really had a very strong impact on me in terms of humility. And I was thinking about this because I saw a friend from Trinidad who happens to be on this on the podcast. And my very first time in Trinidad teaching a family mediation course, 35 people in the classroom. I was nervous, more because I'd never been to Trinidad and I didn't know very much. And so I began with a little introduction and I said, listen, I want to apologize in advance if I ask you to repeat yourselves. I said, you know, I'm trying to get accustomed to your accent. And in unison, 35 people said, what accent? Fortunately, they did it with great humor. They did make fun of me, but they also were just enjoying the moment and the pleasure of connection through humor. So they saw it as a way of making contact with me and me helping me make contact with them rather than belittling me. But it was a humbling moment and a reminder about how that we just have to learn. And sometimes we will stumble our way into those lessons,
Yeah.
you know, inartfully, without particular grace. And all we can do is say, oh, I'm surprised. Thank you. I didn't understand that. Now I do. You know, this is and let me just take one more piece at this in terms of humility, which is recognizing, because we often think of ourselves, we're the experts in the room, right? We're only one. If there are three people in the room, then there are three experts. And this is one of the ways in which we can honor them as experts, to invite them to help us learn how we can use our talents and our knowledge and experience to their best advantage.
Yeah, and that's going to be done by understanding what they're trying to say, by understanding their language or their culture or whatever's driving them. And just looking there with Jane Buzek chatting about how she had to be a translator when she was dealing with gangs in Chicago. Yeah, and that might put you on your metal there when you're dealing with street gangs in so Andre, it says here, I like your approach to broadening the concept of language to more than words or reframing words, but the focus is attempting to grasp each person's unique way of seeing the world and the impact and effect on how this lands on the other person. For me, I'm aware of an energetic transfer, maybe an emotional feeling sent. Sometimes the people with us are not always aware of their impact on the other person, but the mediator being on the outside can see this. So what I'd like to ask you, Andre, would you ever call it out? Would you hold a caucus? Would you say this is the way this is impacting? I can view this, or even ask questions. Do you realize what's happening here? What would
Yeah,
you do there, Andre?
I would potentially have a caucus, but I wouldn't make a statement. So
Okay.
I've spent too long working with Michael to ever make a statement. So
Then a
I
question will
would,
do. Yeah.
yeah. So I probably would ask a question, you know, you just kind of maybe, you know, maybe notice something, you know, and then just, you know, maybe ask them to reflect. So ask them a reflective question on what's happening in the room. So like, what's happening in the room for you? What are you noticing about what's happening in the room? And sometimes people are not aware. You know, I remember being in a mediation and it was a workplace mediation, but somebody was so like it was real kind of anger. And I suppose as mediators, we know that, you know, anger can often be the bodyguard of pain or the protector of shame, or, you know, so it's for us to kind of understand that in some way. And how we understand that is by asking questions. But you're also very mindful that people are vulnerable. So you're not going to ask those questions in front of the other person. You're going to take them, you know, you're going to take them aside or maybe have a conversation to the sideline. But really, if we want people to, you know, learn for themselves or understand their impact, it has to be their reflection. If we tell them, it's not what we're not in, that's not our role to tell them what the impact is on the other person. We could potentially say to the other person, what's it like for you to hear that? You know, let them say it in the room. So it depends. Like, it's hard to say, would I do that every time? It depends on the situation. It might potentially be a caucus, or it might be potentially that I'd ask the other person, what's it like for you to hear that? But I would never make a statement. I would ask a question. Because I think when people reflect on it themselves, that's where the learning is.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't, does that answer your question, Scott?
It does. It's all perfect. And Ilona, we're rapidly running out of time. But we've got a question here from Margaret. The language we use influences how we think about and interpret situation, relationship, and/or issue. As mediators, we can shift or cause dissonance in participants' thinking by using appropriate language or inappropriate that connects with their meaning but broadens their thinking or perspective of view. Any comment on that kind of thing there, Ilona? Hoping you're coming in, not on silent again. Can't see on my screen.
Well,
There we go. There we go.
apologies. I was just thinking when I read the question actually in the chat, and just thinking when you said what you said, Andrea, because instead of going into caucus, I often just push it, not just, but I push it back to the parties actually. When I see that they're reluctant, then I ask them to explain, because another very good mediator said to me, if you have difficulties, then the other person has difficulties as well. And it's not you as a mediator to explain how to unknot their difficulties. They have to come up with it themselves. And if they don't, then it's not the right timing. And if they still don't, then they don't want to be there. Then it's a problem of voluntariness and maybe pre-mediation as well, if they're well prepared to go into mediation. So I think I was always a problem solver, but I'm not very good at it. So, and I will definitely not start doing it now for my people in the mediation. So, but I really have always tried, and I always failed. So I really try to push it back to them and ask them, how does it sit with you? How do you feel? How does it make you feel? Do you have any idea what you could do differently? All these nice open questions, which I had to learn as a language, because, well, in German we're more like closed questions when you say yes or no in the end. So yes, to push it back to them, and in a nice way, gentle, empathy, of course, and everything. So, but that's, yeah, to address things, because I know that I am not a native English speaker, and I know that I'm not a native French speaker. So by pushing it back, they can explain it to me, and then if I understand, they will understand. And that's a very helpful thing.
Thank you very much, Ilona. And you raised another important point there about the value, I think, of pre-mediation to try and understand that code that's in there. Bob, I'm gonna leave you out if it's okay, because we've got the guest from
That's
America.
okay, Scott. I was gonna save both of us by saying the language of silence.
Okay, the language of silence, which hopefully will be. I've also had difficulty with, but we'll use it again. So here, we are going to end shortly. You can see a slide up there, the next TED Talk Club we have. Just see the last comment there from Tony again about the heart and the mind, or the one above it, sorry. We're going to be looking at Guy Winch. How to fix a broken heart. Now, I think that'll be particularly interesting for anyone in family mediation. It's a fantastic video. I've watched it already. But we're going to be looking about confronting things that are happening, and how to confront how things are impacting you, and how that might be very useful. Could I say thank you to our whole panel? We've got Bob Cree, hey there. We have Ilona Kuplik, we have Andre O'Neill, and of course we have Michael Lang. It's been absolutely fantastic having you here, Michael. Hopefully we'll see you again. Folks, the next time that we're going to meet is going to be back to Tuesday, I think. The third Tuesday of the month at 1 o'clock. So hopefully we'll see you then. But thank you to everyone who's been there. Thank you for all your questions. Sorry we couldn't get through them all. But hopefully we'll see you next time on the MII TED Talk Club.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Bye,
Scott.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.